Okay. We are now live. Same connection and link that we had prior. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Obviously, the in-camera session this morning was far more protracted than we had originally anticipated. But we did address a lot of issues that were required to be addressed in camera in accordance with the Municipal Government Act. But we are now back, and we will be continuing our budget discussions until 1 o'clock, when we will conclude today's activity. And we will be meeting again next Friday, July 21st, 9 to 1. A new agenda will be published early next week that will provide an indication of the topics to be discussed on the 21st. So with that, we had some discussion about the best way to make use of this hour-long session this afternoon, and council has determined that it would be best served to have comments and input from councillors around the table on the budget package as it now stands, that was originally presented. Council, that's our plan to do that this afternoon. Okay. Councillor Feeney, would you like to start us off with your observations on the budget?
I'll be brief, I think. I promise. I just think to set up the budget deliberations, it appears to me that there's some consensus around this new objective to build the operating reserve to aspirationally support 6 months worth of spending. And that requirement is being really driven by direction from the province, but it's certainly an extraordinary new requirement that the council and the budget would have to accommodate over a reasonable amount of time. So I do think that if we can come through the budget process with some consensus on if A, we're going to do that, and B, over what duration, that will help frame up the overall story. Because we have, I think, some information around the operating reserve now on page 15, if I understand that. And it's about half of where we need to be. Let's call it half now. So that would require notionally us to underspend our operating budget by some amount, probably as much as $250,000 a year over 2 years to, aspirationally get to say $1 million to $1.2 million within the operating reserve. So we've never kind of budgeted with the goal and objective to like notionally spend less than we have by design, but spend less of the revenue that we take in for all of our operating costs. But I do think if that is something the council is going to support, we should be crystal clear by stating that is our objective, and we should frame up our entire communication storyboard around why we've made the decisions we've made, knowing that that's a core objective. I think the second thing I'd say is around how special the Mahone Bay is, in that we do not fund capital through property tax. Our capital investments are not funded through property tax. They're funded through appropriations from special sources, and that's kind of unique to our town. And I think it's special, and it needs to be really protected. The budget anticipates, so that's gas tax, dividend from area, that's the infrastructure charges, and de-transfer tax, of which has been a huge source of income for the community. And that money is not to be used, historically has not been intended to be used for expenses, but really to be used exclusively for the benefit of long-term important strategic assets, capital. I think we've always been well served by maintaining that philosophy. The budget proposal does suggest that we should move $150,000 of those proceeds into the operating reserve.
From capital to
From
operating.
capital operating reserve, but in the context of the initial commentary I just made, maybe that makes sense. So I think I'll leave it there, but I do think that if we can come out of the process with figuring out how we're going to end up with ever hiring operating reserves in this fiscal year, next fiscal year, to allow us to achieve that initial objective. I think all the other tactical decisions from within the budget will be well discussed and debated by the 7 of us, or 8 of us, actually, and Mo over there too.
You mentioned the sources of the capital funding. If we don't move 150K of the capital funding to the operational, does that de facto mean that the 150 will have to be realized through tax initiatives if we are to realize the requirement of the province?
Yeah, or we'll just have to cut. We'll have to
Or
cut strategic spending, which I think is denoted around 225,000 for the year. So
okay.
of all of the special initiatives
That would be coming from the
that
operating
would be
reserve.
coming from the
Lower
operating
the
reserve,
balance.
right?
Okay. Thank you. Anyone have any questions?
I'll just say, I think it's a very good point in terms of let's project out where we need to be and have a plan to get there. And if that means, and it's not, I'm just for anybody watching, money coming out of the actual capital reserve, it's just money that would have been earmarked to go in the capital reserve from current year revenue, instead going to operating reserve till we achieve some kind of objective. I think it's a very good point that we can be clear about that objective. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. And as a positive, once we've got a well-funded operating reserve, it is only there for emergencies. It could potentially generate some additional revenue as a reserve as well.
Councillor Wilson.
Actually, I don't have a lot to say. I was impressed by the sort of overall feel of the budget. I think, we have added some money, well, it's in the budget, but we've added some staffing this morning, which I guess on balance is a good thing. I think there's room for cuts for things that would have come out of the operating reserve. In sort of a sidebar this morning before we got going, we were talking about things like, do we really have to do a car share program, which isn't a car share program, it's a $40,000 study for a car share program. Can we defer that until future years? And there's a number of other items like that, but I defer to the others to talk about their issues first before we get into the line by line stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Any questions? Councillor Carver.
Did I have my hand up?
Yes.
No, I'm just working my way around.
You're just
And you
you're
had
offering me
a sheet of good
Well, I
questions.
have to say that I am very much at the stage of kind of going through line by line. What does this mean? What does this mean?
Yes.
So I always appreciate the input of people around the table who have a more encompassing view of how the budget works. Even 10 years after being on council, I'm plodding along.
Thank you. Councillor Now?
I'm basically the same way as Council Wilson. A few things that I would like to see talked about when we go line to line, but overall, I know there's been a lot of work into it. I think we had a very good discussion during closed session this morning and straightened some things out there that will show when the budget is finalized. So I'm just ready to go line by line.
All right. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so I mean, we have a good baseline for budget conversation. I appreciate the narrative about operating results and what we need to do, and I think it's important for us to have a plan rather than just be latching on from one budget to the other, making I guess decisions based on what's presented. If we have a plan and say in X amount of years we want that reserve to be 1.x million, then we make that a target. It's much easier to achieve it that way. The question I have is, with the province recommending that, did they recommend, or did they give us leeway to sort of say, well, you have X number of years to play around with your budget to get to that, or is it a demand that they want you need to have that in the next 1-2 years, which is not reasonable, especially for a very small town now of our size. So I'd appreciate some.
Yeah, they haven't given us a specific directive. This is just to all municipalities.
Yeah.
And it comes in the form of a general guideline, but also each year the province positions a financial condition indicators report. And one of the things that report evaluates is whether we do meet what the province has recommended as a target for operating reserve balance. So traditionally, we get a red or yellow on that. Red means yellow means we're off target, but we're doing as well as the average town towards the recommended goal. And red means we're off target and we're off the average of where other towns are with respect to the goal. So Lome has never met the green, we're doing exactly what the province would recommend. But each year they do that, they're just doing it to put continued pressure. They're not setting a timeline and saying this has to be achieved at a certain point. Yeah.
And then thinking about this,
And it's one of 16 different measures. It's not the only
it's
one.
not the only one. Thinking of this sort of, if I take Tullamore Home Bay to be like my household, right? I have to cut my cloth to fit who I am rather than who society thinks I need to be, right? And so, and I say this in the context of as a resident thinking that the town has a pocket of money of 1.2 million that they can play around with, and then increasing my taxes, which might happen down the road. I'm not saying we increase it now, and they can do that down the road. That I find a bit problematic. So the figure for me is a bit. It's a bit up there in a sense whereby you're just thinking, well, those seven guys and women up there have a pocket of money to play around with. That's the way that lands in the community, that you have all these largesse that you can spend. And so even as we think about that recommendation from the province, I just sort of say, yes, they've recommended that, but maybe that might not be our target. Our target needs to be reasonable to who our electorate is, and then being comfortable, I guess, what we can do. So maybe it's not 6 months, maybe it's 4 months.
So,
yeah.
So I think, not in the middle of the budget process, not to add another thing to our new manager of finance's to-do list, but, we've talked a lot about having a reserve policy in the past. We don't have a reserve policy. That is a place where these type of objectives would be laid out. And one of the things that reserve policy could do, and we had a little sidebar conversation about this, is maybe operating reserve versus contingency reserve. Maybe we need to set a target for a contingency reserve and essentially tie our hands around when that would be used, make it very explicit to the public why this contingency reserve exists. And in doing so, hopefully, the amount that it would generate in terms of revenue as a fund that is not intended to be used very much and therefore is available for investment. I think to the point about how residents might feel if they knew that we had $1 million in the bank to play around with, but if they knew that we were binding our hands in terms of playing around with it, and also it was going to be worth a couple of cents on their tax rate in revenue being generated from an investment that we don't have to go to them to pay for operations. All of a sudden, then it's a good thing for people because it's saving money. So maybe that policy sometime later this year, and then that'll guide next year's budget in a more definitive way, as opposed to, as you say, just making it up as we go along.
Something to add as a potential discussion item to the policy and strategy committees.
Yeah, maybe,
Agenda?
the council could put that on that list. I don't know, Maureen, when it's appropriate to make that kind of a direction. Maybe we make it today before we end. But it would just be a motion to add development of a reserve policy to policy and strategy committee's
So
pile of future agenda. There you go.
Deputy Mayor has moved the motion. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Carver seconds. On that particular motion, to add the reserve policy on contingencies to the policy and strategy committee. All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you.
So we were still doing the go around.
We are still
I don't know
doing
if
the
that was your whole
go-around.
point, Francis, but good to do it.
Deputy Mayor, are you?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. Councillor Burdick, who is at home.
Thank you. And thank you for your tolerance with that. I had an awful case of the sneezes today and I didn't want to sneeze on you all. Yeah, my general sense of the budget was that it's a really good sort of nuts and bolts sort of budget. I do think that this information about the province's requirements is, clearly something that we need to pay attention to. Keeping in mind, though, that their goal is always austerity as a sort of philosophical point. And I think that we can balance our own requirements, against that. And look at our commitment to the individuals in the town. I also saw lots of things there that I think can be sort of deprioritized in order to get the budget, a little bit lower. So certain projects that have been sort of waiting for a little while, like the pool, for example, to get what it needs. And then maybe other things, we'll go through this when we do the line by line, but other things could maybe be considered in the next couple of years or possibly the next term because they weren't actually either priorities at the beginning of our discussion as council of what our specific priorities are going to be, or B, can be just put down the list a little bit, like the how electric vehicles are employed, or which ones we use, or how we're working on that particular project. But overall, very impressed with the budget. Like Councillor Carver, I am also a lot of the budget work is, for me as a layperson, is getting used to budgets laid out in a municipal context. But I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Burdick. As everyone, as people around the table, Councillor Carver and Councillor Burdick in particular, I've been on council since 2008, and budget time is always a time of mystery for me. I must say that this particular budget, with our new finance manager and some of the things that have happened with our new CAO over the last few years, every year it gets a little bit easier for me to understand. And that's saying something for me to understand it. However, and as I suggested this morning, the point we have to keep in mind is that we're talking about funding that is provided by the taxpayers and or citizens of Mahone Bay. We're now dealing with outrageous house prices. Interest rates are on the climb. Inflation is increasing. Food, fuel, all of those items are more expensive. So it's doubly important for us as councillors in the town that we make decisions that enhances the value that our citizens receive from the town, and that we are making maximum use of the monies that the taxpayers do provide. And I am confident that this council in particular, again, has that mindset, which we had for the last couple of budgets. But this year we've got a much improved budget process to enable us to envision the way ahead. I look forward to the remainders of our discussions. Councillor Carter.
Can I just add to my go-around comment?
Sure.
That one of the things that I struggle with in looking at the budget and understanding it is the fact that we have budgets within budgets on the different utilities. And that the costs are allocated differently to different sub-budgets. So that it becomes hard to grasp, where does this number come from? And to have to cross-reference back to
Mhm.
two other sub-budgets or,
Yeah.
so I'm just saying this as part of my own self-disclosure about learning the budgets so that people who may be watching can understand some of the complexity of how the town budget process works and how complex the overall picture is for this little tiny town.
But we also have the NJSB budget that we participate in and the area budget, which further complicates the whole process. Councillor Finn.
So, Mayor, I just think as like how we work through this in a logical format, we'd have, kind of town general and fire protection, special operating projects and capital investments kind of as a separate sets of categories than the two utilities. And it suggests that, based on the budget numbers provided, I think there's quite a bit of concern I'd have around, especially the electrical utility. The water utility's got its own ongoing challenges of not having scale. And having been really negatively impacted by, kind of global supply chain issues and commodity pricing, things like chemicals. And that's nothing that, is within staff's control. It's the realities and the vagaries of the marketplace. But I do think we're going to need to require to carve quite a bit of time to figure out our commentary and our final budgeting and our strategies around the electrical utility, because it's kind of unsustainable based on what we've seen in the package thus far. I don't know when we're going to get to that point, but, I think we should probably maybe carve out a purpose-specific conversation just on the electrical utility.
Yeah, I was kind of listening to the go around, like where people would like to see some focus. So for the next session on the 22nd, it probably makes sense to break down discussion of draft budget to have a couple of different specific headings to kind of structure the conversation. So electric utility could be put up as a heading of its own. A couple people referred to it as a line by line review. I know in Alice's case, she made reference specifically to some capital items. So it probably is a good idea to go through capital, go down the list of projects and make a point of doing that. I don't know, we wouldn't really intend to do a line by line review of operating next time, except that people may want to call out a specific point and ask about,
Just a special.
yeah, so maybe we say next time around discussion, we'll highlight electrical utility and special projects and operating initiatives and capital projects as, points for review and discussion at the next meeting. In the meantime, we're going to have hour left today, either can move into those deferred staff reports or could jump into one of those subjects. So I think it's too little time for electrical, but we could jump into looking down the special projects or looking down the capital projects. I feel like for the capital projects discussion, we're better off getting to these staff reports if we can. So I don't know if council will be willing. We've done a go round. Do we want to jump right into those staff reports for discussion? One or all?
Councillor Wilson.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
So do we want to follow the order they're listed on the agenda or cherry pick one of them? Start with that. Anybody have any
You
preference?
see which is gonna be the most straightforward.
Well, I mean, the low income report's probably
That's
more
optimistic,
straightforward than
Council.
the other staff reports. I would say of the other one, service extensions has less to it.
Yeah.
So we could start with low income or service extensions if we're just trying to pick the ones that might be quicker conversations.
Service extensions.
Start from the bottom going up.
Yeah, you could do that, you go backwards. I feel like the low income is probably a pretty quick one, because if you guys need more information, you're just asking for it. So if everybody's comfortable to start with that, yeah.
With the low income.
Yeah, low income. Because I presume, so basically I'll introduce this like we always would. So we were told to bring the actual RISE policy, what would that look like based on council's previous motion that set targets, that set ranges for compensation. And we've also included some analysis in the staff report having to do with what the impact on the budget would be, which substantiates the notion that a $30,000 budget, at least to see what the uptake of the program is, that's compared to about a $10,000 budget last year, would be a reasonable budget, and that's already included in the budget. So the recommendation in the staff report was that at the regular council meeting on July 28th, because of course this is policy, the council would approve the updated policy, which would then allow us, because we pretty much need it on the same day as the budget's being approved, to implement those grants when the public are receiving their second tax bill for the final tax bill for the year.
Comments?
I guess I was
Councilor Bean?
just saying, I think we had a good conversation about this at one of our last meetings. We know that the policy kind of directionally aligns with kind of adjacent communities on the South Shore. I think Councilor Carver brought up some very specific details about Lunenburg, kind of as a good benchmark. So I guess we won't know what the full financial impact will be until we see the uptake. But it looks to me like it's a $20,000 increase from $10,000 base. And I think there is a limit to how much tax we can forego. But for the time being, at least for this calendar year, if the assumptions are accurate, it looks like it's an increase of $20,000 of essentially a foregone charge.
Incremental $20,000.
It's basically, we're foregoing revenue. right?
Yes.
Versus it's not really an
We're not
operating
paying
cost, right?
anything.
Right.
And so what we did to get to that number was essentially, Ashley took last year's applicants, the amount they would have received would change under the new policy. So adjusting for that with no new applicants. And then we looked at the fact that the qualifying criteria would now include new potentially qualifying people.
Mhm.
And so what we did was we went back to the census, 2016, still the most current, and took the percentage of uptake we were getting from the people who did qualify and applied that to the number of households understood by the census to now be qualified.
Mhm.
But they would only be qualifying for the 250 rebate because they're at the top end of the spectrum. So we took the same percentage of would-be eligible people at that amount and added that as well. So those are the two things we did. What we didn't do is include an increase in the percentage of people who qualified last time, who didn't choose to apply, who might choose to apply this time. And obviously, we also didn't factor in any change to the demographics of Mahone Bay that's happened between 2016 and now, because we don't have that information yet. The census does provide households broken down by income, so we can kind of get a sense of what the uptake has been and what it could be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Councillor
I
Wilson.
was just gonna say, at best, it's a guess, an educated guess. But I think we should just proceed with it and see where we land.
Yeah,
Deputy Mayor?
I was just about to say, if council is comfortable, let's move this and we'll see what hits us.
Yeah.
Well, we can't actually move until the 28th, so as long as we're
That's right,
comfortable, we'll
okay.
just leave this on the agenda for the regular meeting on the 28th.
28th of July.
July, okay.
Yeah.
So it'll be the same one on which the final approval of the budget is anticipated, presuming everything goes to plan.
Mhm.
Did our finance manager have a comment?
No, I think you guys hit all the points that I was gonna suggest, so.
Okay, so we'll see that again, that'll go on to the agenda for the July 28th council meeting. Okay.
We continue to work backwards, we go to 3.3.
Service extension.
So all three of these have the same recommendation, which is essentially, we didn't include any of this in the budget. And these are all capital items, I should say. We didn't include any of these in the budget, but what this report covers is discussions council has had about possible service extensions. We've gone back and forth, we've looked for some additional funding, we've gotten some additional estimates with, costs have skyrocketed and everything, and that affects these as well. But we got a number of possible service extensions, and there's a part in our strategic plan that specifically says the council will look for strategic opportunities for service extensions
Mhm.
that could drive the rest of the council's strategic objectives, which include a growing population, which include provision of affordable housing. So I looked at this through that lens. Essentially, we've got these different scenarios, but none of them specifically speak to an anticipated new large-scale development that would achieve council's objectives. Maybe they will, and if they did in the future, that would give us an opportunity. But I think that ought to be some of the deciding factor for council. Now, the one exception to that is the service extension that's been proposed for Main Street, going out towards Maker's Cove. And that one was pointing to council strategic objectives under environmental pillars, specifically stewardship of the harbor, because it was intended to address some of the remaining straight pipes. In terms of leveraging for development,
Yeah.
we know, because it was on the open agenda, we just had a discussion, there's one property that its development could be contingent on this somewhat. But there's not a lot of other room that we're necessarily seeing or push that we're seeing for development in that area. So I will note that that project on Main Street is in the budget already, but only as a component of our ICIP Priority 1 project. The question for council to some extent would be, presuming we don't get that funding, this would be breaking out just the extension. There's more in that ICIP project and contemplating doing it at our own cost as a standalone project.
And Dylan, that line item, I think, just going through the deck, was that 180,000 or am I?
Oh, no, they're all much more than that now.
This was to go from, this was going from the driveway up to the sewage treatment plant to the Mater's Cove boundary. That's what we're talking about,
Yes,
to
yeah,
9,958.
But it was for water and wastewater,
Water and
and
wastewater.
it's up to $480,000.
480.
So there's also the question there whether, in any of these cases, whether we would contemplate cost sharing arrangements
Yeah.
with the property owners, and that is still a possibility. I know in this case, at least one of the property owners has approached us with a willingness to do that.
I mean, in a perfect world, I mean, if we were in a situation where at 480 and we were able to commit, 300 and get 160 from the various homeowners, that kind of ratio. I think we've waited a number of years, waiting for the partners to come through with their dollars, but as it relates to the straight pipes, like we haven't had a lot of joy there. Like, at some point, you'd think about maybe prioritizing it.
Okay, Councillor Carver.
This may be a little off the wall, but just thinking about the geography there, so you go out east towards Lunenburg and you hit the boundary line and then there's modal. And then there's more straight pipes, I assume.
Yeah.
And is there any possibility for negotiating something with modal in terms of a line extension?
That's an interesting question. I mean, considering that this is presumably parked until we get our answer on the ICIP application, staff could reach out to modal on that basis. Yeah,
Mhm.
they'd probably be good to do a motion to direct us to do that.
I mean, the overall goal is environmental as well as.
Yes. And it could also drive tax base in their area by providing people with a.
No, that's a good idea.
Do you want to make a motion to direct staff to reach out to them?
Yes, I would make that motion to direct staff to reach out to modal.
Thank you, seconded by Councillor Carver, or Councillor Wilson. You've heard the motion?
Can I just ask a question?
On the question.
Motion that I seconded. How far?
Well, I mean, I guess
That
we
would be
just,
part of the discussion.
yeah,
I mean,
the further you go, the more cost there's associated,
Yeah.
and there's lift stations and stuff entailed, but.
like you're trying to build a project. We'd have 3 funding sources, Mahone Bay, Modal, and the town homeowners.
And I mean,
It's
it's, even another thing to go back to the province again, I guess, because I always indicate that 2 municipalities are more likely to get funded than one.
Personally, Mayor, I think it would be a real, I think it's important that we finally get rid of the straight pipes if we have it within our power to do so by the end of the term. Yes, yeah.
Even if
Right.
we don't wait for ICA,
I don't
I
think-
realize it's very expensive,
Mhm.
but I think it has gone on for far too long. It needs to be addressed.
So does
Anything
that,
else?
so does that mean that, assuming we pass the motion, that even if we don't get funding, we would still go to the town boundary, or if we don't get any cooperation?
Well, we're gonna talk to MODL and see what the temperament is there for,
It would probably be the same time frame to hear back on ICIP as it will be to reach out to MODL, so by September.
I guess the point is like, I'm open-minded about a further appropriation that's not in the core program to do that project.
Appropriation.
When we get down, because this is gonna take a couple months. So whether we need to accommodate that line extension within the budget, I would think it would come out of a special drawdown of the capital reserve after all of the dust settles.
And what we've already got in the budget represents a 27% share of a larger project.
Mhm.
So if that project doesn't move forward, we take our 27% share and that becomes the beginning of this. So it's not gonna be that much of a difference in the allocation that's already in the budget because we've already got this, we're just not gonna get as much work done for the
I
money.
just get the impression like we're at least a year away before we get those dollars.
Okay.
With the
Councillor Allen?
town boundaries, do we have any idea? I know there's only about half a dozen houses in there. How many of those have straight pipes? Do they all have straight pipes?
Within town?
The ones within town, from the
We
sewer
did,
treatment
so
plant
I
down.
don't know if any have been eliminated since 2018. That was when we did the study. I think it was 5. at the
Five.
time. Yeah, but there may have been change. I mean, I don't know if there's been any
Because I mean,
change.
it is,
Yeah.
unlawful for them to have them in effect, so they have to put in a septic system of their own, so even if each household contributed basically what would cost for. a
Yeah, we're looking
septic
at
system.
$30,000-$40,000 for the septics on some of those properties.
On some
so
of
yeah,
them.
it's pretty fair.
And we know the yellow house.
Okay. We have, the motion is still on the table, Councillor Carter. Was it on the question?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the absence of a policy on the cost sharing, can we still work out arrangements with private property owners?
I mean, it's something I have to do a little bit, how do we do it? But I do believe it can be done. I just, yeah, we'll have to see how we
Thank
do it.
Okay.
Easier with a set mechanism, but there's, work.
On the motion, all in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you.
Still have a question, Mayor, I have a question about the other line extension on Fairmont Street
Mhm.
that we've had the request from the homeowner
Yeah.
that's outstanding. So there's, as I go through the budget document, there's a number of other items around the runoff and some construction work at the end of Fairmont as well, around the soccer field.
Yeah,
and
not the same
drainage.
area, but it is on Fairmont Street. Yeah.
Just like 100 yards down from this line extension we're talking about.
Yeah, that was, so for anybody who knows the street well, the drainage
Yeah.
work is from the height of the hill down, going down. And then this is talking about on the other crest of the hill, down to the dead end of the road. So, yeah.
So I guess when I looked at that in the absence of seeing like a business case there, I'd say, I think the information said we had about $40,000 in construction costs to run the water up to that home.
Yeah, the contrast was at 40,000 just to serve the Cleveland
Just the one
property,
home.
or 446 to do both
Right.
water and wastewater to the end of the road.
So, I mean, that would be probably at least a 20-year payback, but that's, not outrageous for the utility.
And you
You
could
know.
again come and say, we'll meet you halfway, but it could be challenging for this.
I mean, those are all the business cases are gonna look like that. Like my sense of things is like there aren't going to be any quick payback business cases for the water utility, but the water utility doesn't have the benefit of scale. So when we inevitably get to the water utility discussion, unless we make the investments through capital, we'll never, ever get the water utility scale big enough to generate enough operating
Yes, that's right.
income. So like, I know that we can't get a payback on 40 because what's the average water bill? Like, let's call it $150 a month. We know that the payback will be long, but we have to do some of these projects, these little non-economically justified line extensions if we're ever going to get scale within the utility. So,
And I mean, it may be actually putting on the table that there are conditions that would motivate the town to do the extension. So the Fairmont Street, I think we're pretty clear that the property owners, we reach out to them, don't have any immediate plans for development. If those properties that are undeveloped changed hands and there was a desire to see multi-unit development down there, all of a sudden there'd be a lot more rationale for council. Similarly, the one on Kinburn Street, that property can support another multi-unit development similar to the one that is adjacent to it. And in that scenario, there'd be a lot more for the town than possibly 3 or 4 single-family homes.
Is that Kinburn up by Park Street?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I mean, the owner of the property has not indicated any intentions around larger scale development.
This is the new one.
No, this is the current owner. I didn't see, that's the point. I don't know where it could go in terms of, yeah.
I guess I was thinking about the place that just sold.
So if the conditions were to change such that all of a sudden, somebody's coming to town saying, I want to build a multi-unit building here. We have already a scope of work and we could engage that, and I'd say here on Kinbury or on Park Street, there are developable lots on Park Street.
So in
Councillor Carter,
relation,
Renee, Councillor Now.
in relation to the Fairmont extension possibility down to the dead end, it could, in theory, then be extended again if the inland landlocked properties were ever developed on the other side of the trail.
Yeah,
in theory.
it wouldn't even necessarily be on our end, it would just be on the private property, connect into it.
Right. So currently, the discussion is to take it to the dead end. Do property owners have an option not to hook into the systems if they're currently happy with whatever systems they have on their properties, wells or septic?
I think when we put the system in originally, Councillor Carver, people had a choice. They didn't have to take the water, but they were going to be connected to the sewer. And I believe that is still the case, I think. Like Hawthorne Hill, that's the kind of arrangement they have up there.
Yeah, you're not necessarily obligated to join into either, but considering there is no wastewater rate, and you're already paying for it in your taxes, who wouldn't want to connect to wastewater?
Yeah.
And nobody loves their septic, it's not like the septic provides, like it's, some people love their well, but yeah, but we can't I know we can't, because it's board regulated, we can't obligate connections to the water utility.
I thought we couldn't obligate connections to the water side, but we could.
That's what I mean, yeah,
Sewer
so only the water is regulated,
Yeah,
so we could make people connect to sewer, and we have in the past, but it is also of no economic import to the town if they do, because you don't pay for it, yeah.
So,
As Barry would argue, he's already paid for it.
yeah, so if you, like, if you net out the subsidy coming across from the hydrants, like the water utility has a structural deficit. We're not generating enough like operating margin just from selling the water and then netting out against our costs to sell the water to pay even the long-term debt and the interest on the loans. Like we will have losses every year forever unless we grow we grow the size of the customer base.
But unless it's multi-unit developments, it just isn't
Fair.
gonna make that much difference.
I agree, but we have homes in town now who are putting their hands up and saying, help me. And so they're not all gonna be winners financially, but sometimes we just need to do it because it strikes me, like the Cleveland request, I think, should be reevaluated in the context of, okay, that home will generate X dollars of revenue over a 10-year period. And we know the margins are high. If you think about an incremental cost, like really how much money we really truly investing, it's notionally a subsidy for that line extension. Let's call it half of it. It's $20,000 essentially grant, because we know, but there'll be a councilor sitting around the table in 2050. And the water utility will still be getting that revenue, even though the payback will be, like, it's not gonna be easier 5 years from now to do these line extend, to do one or two of these. So that, I do think that the Cleveland request, that was a direct request to council. So we either have to go back and say, we're not going to do it. We thank you for your request. No, we're not going to give you access to water and sewer, I think in that example too, wasn't it, Dylan? I'm not sure if that was water, just water, just water.
Yeah, because sewer going uphill is very expensive, water going downhill is.
Yeah, so from like, I think if we have a bunch of backhoes doing a bunch of work on Fairmont Street, like, I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity there. So I wouldn't break my heart if we just take another quick look at that and we storyboard it in the context of, here's my $40,000 in cost and here's the revenue I'm gonna enjoy actually say over a 10-year period. And like, what does that look like from a quick little back napkin business case? And if it's under
2050, you'll still be the counselor.
I don't know, there'll be somebody here, there'll be a little Kangata on council, running the, who will be a tall older Kangata.
Counselor, now I apologize. I had, I
That's-
saw your question.
Okay.
All right.
Basically on the same lines as what Councilor Feeney is saying, I think these people have been paying taxes for quite some time, not getting all the services. So I think where possible, we have to make every effort to try to extend some of these services to the people that are paying the same taxes as everybody else in the town. So I think we have to make efforts to provide the services that are available. It might not pay back right now, but who knows? If we extend back, say, Fairmont Street, down the road, someone might say, oh, they got services there, so we'll put in a subdivision, or we'll put in a development. If it's not there, then they're gonna think maybe twice about doing so. So I think, where possible, I think we should be putting some of these extensions in, especially like if we have an opportunity to eliminate some of the straight pipes, then most definitely, let's do it.
Yeah, for me, it's a real embarrassment that in 2022, we're still dealing with straight parking. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of from my perspective, a little bit of a challenge in sort of squaring this a little bit, in the sense that the straight pipes, we want to get rid of them. And we will invest some money into that, but then we'll think about cost sharing with residents. Now, I know in the Cleveland property, there's a nuance to that, but the general public might not fully appreciate that. So as we contemplate it, I think there's a fair bit of storyboarding that needs to happen around the equity issue and why this can be or should be viewed differently. And then I would, if it was up to me, if I was the one making the call, I would say, put in the line. I think it's necessary to do it, but I think it's important that it's communicated in a way that doesn't create those are kind of narrative when we were discussing the policy that has been suggested on cost sharing, that I found to be not very beneficial for our town. I think where possible, cost sharing should happen, because some of these projects will never happen if that doesn't work out. But also there are places where cost sharing is not possible and the town can still do these things. And that way you sort of, people might think, well, it's a rich subsidizing for the poor, but to a certain extent, it's trying to make sure that we are all equitable in what we do, and making sure that all our citizens or residents are getting the same amount of comfort that we can provide. Yeah, so I think for me that the storyboarding of, if we're going to do these two pieces, which I would be very in support of, how we storyboard it is important, that it doesn't get lost in the minutiae of the conversation.
So as
So
far
if I
as
could,
the-
if I might, sorry, no. I'd move that council direct staff to provide a 10-year cash flow analysis of the line extension to the Cleveland property that would include the benefits to the water utility from incremental water charges and kind of proxied up expenses. Anyway, you know what we're doing. And to report back to council with that information. I think that might already be on the council agenda with the due date of February
Well,
2021.
yeah, this-
But
yeah.
I think if we could rescind that motion. and
No,
just give-
that's
which
okay.
is gonna-
This motion is
this
fine
one-
as
this
it
one will be
is.
fine.
I think we have to bring this to our next,
You know what I'm
do this
talking
right away and bring this to the
Yeah.
next meeting though.
July.
Sure.
I'm
Can I
thinking
get
to the
some
22nd.
clarification on the motion? And was it just for the Cleveland request or
Well,
for
so,
the dead end? The
Yeah,
whole-
so the Cleveland property is a standalone,
Right.
just, piece of work. And then, I think I anticipate that if with the other project, we'll have consultations with Modal and with the homeowners, notionally see if they can put together a package. But I wouldn't think that would be even something we would be able to find, right? Would we be able to bring that into this year's budget before we approve the budget?
Which one? are you talking
This,
Not-
the
not-
bigger,
I
the
don't
straight
think
pipe.
we
about? No,
No,
you couldn't bring the
no.
straight pipe in, but you could bring the Cleveland one in, and so my suggestion would be that this motion, which I don't even think has a seconder yet, would, Kelly's good, all right, so that would be for the 22nd,
Yeah.
like Ashley could whip this up, it's
Yeah,
not that much, we'll have to have this at the next meeting. And what you'll be considering at that point is, are you gonna add this Cleveland extension to this
Capital
year's
projects.
capital budget, like
Yeah.
actually add it? And considering the request is already a year old,
Hmm.
I think it's only meaningful if we can.
So we can do-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, just a clarification, the amount put in here is purely for water, right?
Yeah.
It's just purely water.
Because you have to have a lift pump to get the sewer up the hill.
Yeah,
I think that was one of the drawbacks to that piece that's now an extension included in the water and sewer projects, what, 60, 70 years ago.
So the other little detail, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so my question around that was, it might sound very weird to do this. But since the ground will be dug up, there will be lines being put in. We know the lift pump is the most expensive piece of any kind of work here. Is it possible to just put lines in there and cap it
While you got the ground over.
while you got the ground open? And if, for instance, the properties on that other side of the trail open up at some point and they're interested in hooking up, then you're not digging up, you're not basically paying for that.
And that was only down until the point where we were going to go with the water and not further than that. We can look at that, I mean, it's a bit of an odd question, but yeah, I don't know, maybe cap line in the ground and come back to it later. It's
I wouldn't think the
Oh, yeah.
cost would be that much more.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Councilor Wilson.
First of all, let the record show that I second.
Councilor Wilson is the seconder on Councilor Feeney's motion, which is on the table. We're having questions on the question at the
If
moment.
my memory serves, to the deputy mayor's point, I think you have to have your water and sewer lines on opposite sides of the road now. So you can't put them in the
Can't
same,
get leakage
can't put them in
between
the
them.
same trench anymore.
Yeah,
Oh, really?
there are more separations than you'll find with the historic lines, so one of the concerns I had was we'd have to check on where are the historic lines? Because if we're digging up, if the historic lines are right together at the top of the hill already, and we know that they're later going to need to be separated, maybe there is an opportunity to get them out of being in this old alignment. A lot of the time they were right next to each other. But I'm not the person to ask about that. We get a little bit more information about that before next week's meeting. That's no problem.
Okay,
So I was just gonna mention before we go to a vote, the one other piece was included in here, we've got some surface work, that this is Fairmont Street happens to be one of 3 dirt roads, this is the extension part at the end. So obviously, if there's any contemplated work under the surface, you're not gonna do anything with the surface. But I will come back to, if we decide to do the Cleveland part, there's a recommendation from Public Works to look at not having a dirt road surface anymore. If at that time we could chip seal the road and know that we're not likely to be returning to it anytime soon. There's a price in here for an estimated chip seal. There's also prices in here for Stovepipe and Park Street, which are the 2 other dirt roads. And I think the Park Street could be contingent still on, are we going to sometime down the road, see development on Kidburn and extend our services, and then would we want to consider extending them on Park? And Park Street doesn't see a ton of washout, so it may be reasonable to wait. Stovepipe, short of one property that has specifically come to town asking about possibly being developed off Stovepipe, if that could be resolved, we're spending as much per year maintaining Stovepipe as that's what this quote would be to chip seal it. So I would recommend that we do chip seal Stovepipe, but we would want to wait until we verify if there is potential for this one other property to be developed. We're still exploring if that line would even run under Stovepipe for technical reasons.
Councilor Carver, quickly.
So before I ask my question about the chip seal on Fairmont Street, are we still? Oh, we've
Yes,
already
the
done
Chip
the-
seal on
have
Fairmont
we done
Street
the-
would be on the motion, so otherwise we could vote. and
Oh,
then-
it'd be on the motion?
That's why I brought it up. I
Okay,
brought it up
my-
because of
my-
that.
My question is about that very sharp hump when you're going down the hill. If you're going out towards the dead end,
Mhm.
would that be changed if it was going to be chip sealed? Every time I go over there, I worry about the underside of my car.
I'd have to go drive it again then to see, but we wouldn't have anything that would make somebody worry about the underside of the car anyway, no.
No, but it's also, there's also a visibility sightline issue there, because if you're approaching the hill, you can't see what traffic.
At the
is
end of the
oncoming.
pavement, you mean?
At the end of the pavement, yeah.
Yeah. by the more-
It's a very
Very more.
sharp drop.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
It is.
yeah.
yeah.
The biggest hazard is when you're coming out of Fairmont Street, you come up that hill and you don't have any idea what's.
You have no,
Yeah,
no, the sight line is terrible.
Bad news is there's only one person to hit,
Yeah.
but he's a lawyer.
But I don't think that might not change too much then.
With the chip seal, no,
It
okay.
doesn't
well,
waste any time coming up that road.
register that concern somewhere.
Anyway, thanks for the motion.
Back to the motion.
In clarifying,
Mhm.
you said this motion would include the chip seal on Fairmont, so.
No, I'm not saying that the motion would, I'm saying that if the motion passes
Amend the
and
motion.
we bring the report to the next meeting,
Yeah.
and then council says, let's add this Cleveland request extension to the budget, then we might also at that time consider adding the chip seal contingent on doing them both, yeah. That was why I wanted to bring it up, just so it was understood.
Deputy CAO,
That was my question as well about the motion. At this point, I'm still working with Councilor Keating's original motion, but Deputy Mayor Kangata had a point about costs for adding an extra pipe while the road is torn up. And then the CAO has just answered the question about that. So I just want to clarify that is the motion on the table still only Councilor Fee's original motion? Or have there been any?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, we just needed to all understand all of the things that were.
Okay.
Just for the water cost.
all in favor? The motion is carried. And it is 1 minute past 1. That's our appointed cessation time. I would remind the folks at home who may be watching that the next budget discussion meeting is scheduled for Friday, the 22nd of July at 9 a.m. It'll run 9 to 1. There will be an agenda for that meeting coming out from Town Hall early next week. And we look forward to having you come back and join us for that discussion. Deputy Mayor?
In terms of clarification for this staff report, my assumption is that we haven't fully exhausted it, or do we?
Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it on for the next meeting.
Yeah, we'll finish it up then.
Okay.
Okay. Councilor Kerr?
Well, I was gonna make a motion to adjourn, but do we want to do questions first before adjourn, or do we adjourn?
We don't, we haven't done questions at a special meeting, but
No,
has
No, we
anyone
wouldn't.
tendered a question?
No, we don't have any questions.
Okay,
okay, motion to adjourn.
well, thank you. Do we have a seconder? Councilor Now, all in favor? Go out and enjoy the sun. Play in the summer weather.
Yeah, actually, you thought this was gonna be painful.